Hi, John.
Hi, Matthew. How are you?
I'm good. I'm enjoying the socialism.
Yeah, no, it feels differently already. I feel less individual responsibility.
Right.
I'm going to go out for a cheeseburger, maybe take up drinking and smoking, because I can get hardworking, healthy people to pay for it now. Why should I be one of the healthy
Well,
sectors?
some of us around the office, we were pretty convinced by the end of last week that Pelosi could get the votes together. So we actually went Thursday night to Fogo de Chao. All you can eat Brazilian barbecue. Figured,
Sure.
someone else will pick up the tab for the surgeries.
Yeah. Let's make Paul Ryan do it. I'm going to be laughing at that guy when I'm being wheeled into the hospital.
Exactly. No,
20
it's
years
it's gonna be awesome. Yeah. Well, but it does. It feels good to win, right?
It's a pretty unusual experience. I mean, electoral wins are pretty much just the promises of future wins like this.
Right.
And there's been, in my lifetime, there's been two big electoral wins where people got excited, but zero events like this that have followed them.
Right.
And I feel like no one really knows how to handle it. And naturally, the conservatives, I think, are flipping out a little bit, which I'd expected. But it's pretty unusual.
Yeah, I mean, because you don't want to say that the Clinton administration never scored legislative victories or didn't do important things, but the things the Clinton administration did that were important were not necessarily super left wing, and the things the Clinton administration did that were really sort of firmly liberal were just not that big.
Right.
Right. I mean, so I mean, I guess I'm a free trader. I mean, NAFTA, Uruguay round, those kind of things. Bringing the deficit under control. I mean, I think that was all important, and it all sort of made the country a safer place. But those are not sort of the signature achievements of the progressive movement in the way that this was. And I think it's been interesting. I think you saw more people sort of coming to realize that over the weekend, right as this bill was coming to pass. I mean, you wrote back in December when the Senate passed its bill about how sort of strange it was that a lot of liberals. I mean, it's not just that a small number of liberals were actively opposing the bill, but everyone was being kind of grumbly about it, and I feel like that largely evaporated.
I think that's right. Somehow the final sprint to the finish. And the feverish competition, and I think the realization that the Republicans were making such a big deal out of this, hey, maybe there actually is something at stake, was part of it.
Right. Although I did think, I mean, even though we sort of got a beneficial outcome in the end, I felt that this whole sort of process was a real. It really illustrated the sort of political disempowerment. Political and social disempowerment of poor people in the United States. That you had a debate about the bill that was conducted, in the press, in which the sort of you had a lot of debates within the progressive camp between sort of centrist technocrat types and sort of activists who were very ideological and very sort of, interested in the public option, very interested in punishing insurance companies, very interested in punishing special interest groups in a way that this bill didn't do. And, you never once see on TV or on an op-ed page or, anywhere in the official discussion, like a person who, is near the poverty line, and if they get a Medicaid expansion, they can go see a doctor and not otherwise.
Yeah, no, that's a completely politically demobilized group of people. And that was one of the complaints that I had that I'm sure you share with a lot of the centrist commentary, the Washington Post editorial page and elsewhere, which viewed expanding coverage as dessert, as if this was something that's very easy to do. Like anytime they want, they could go raise taxes on the rich and provide coverage to these people who lack insurance. The real hard stuff is the coverage controls. And I agree, the cost controls. And I agree that the cost controls are hard, but, opportunities to to transfer resources from the rich to provide coverage to the uninsured only come along very, very rarely. I mean, that's not sitting there. And if that's all they did, which it's not, but if it was, that would still be a pretty big deal.
Right, but I mean, there was a weird politics around this where I don't think that, and I think consciously, the president and the congressional leaders did not sort of pitch the case in those terms.
Right.
And I've even had instances. I mean, I remember back, when sort of the stimulus was a hotter topic, sort of getting the sense that, people were being discouraged from talking about how much in the Recovery Act was like helping poor people, and something similar in the healthcare. I mean, there's a lot of polling, particularly on healthcare that I've seen over the years to show that. People really wanted to sort of put an emphasis on the middle class, on how this is helping average families, not make it sound like this was just some big nutty scheme to say that, poor people should get medicine. But to a substantial extent, I mean, there's a lot of different things in this bill, but to a substantial extent, I mean, that's what it is. I mean,
a nutty scheme to help poor people get medicine?
Yeah. I mean, not nutty, but
right.
I mean, it's
to get some clarification there.
But I mean, that's what it does. I mean, if really, really, truly, all you cared about was bending the cost curve or whatever, you can easily do that without. This level of expenditures.
Well, I'm not sure that's completely true. First of all, I think a lot of the people you're helping are really and truly not poor. The poor people are on Medicaid. The poorest people are on Medicaid. So the people you're talking about who are uninsured, they're not politically organized.
Right.
They're not wealthy, but they're pretty middle class. They're middle class and working class people, and who become poor because they get sick often,
right.
But are not people who come from poverty.
Well, but I mean, a lot of the expansion of coverage in this bill simply comes from bringing the Medicaid eligibility up and having the federal government pay for it. So, I mean, a lot of what it's doing is that in a lot of the, a lot of states are both, have a lot of poor people in them, are relatively poor states, and also have very conservative political cultures. So that, in places like Arizona, Alabama, the Medicaid eligibility is extremely stingy. And this bill, to some extent, I mean, a lot of the coverage expansion is just making sure that people in the South and West who would be covered if they lived in New York now sort of will be covered. And that's, I mean, I think that's important, but it for various reasons, it's not been sort of the highlight of the conversation. People, at around 100% of the poverty line.
Yeah, no, I think it's well above 100. I don't have the figures in front of me, but I think the figure we're talking people well above 100% of the poverty line.
Well, I mean, to some of them, but I mean that a lot of when you just look at what is the expansion is in bringing it to everyone who's at I think 150%, because like in many states. People with no children are not Medicaid eligible now, and the bill will make them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, the people who are being covered, the poorest are being covered by raising the Medicare level, and the rest are being covered through tax credits.
Right. Well,
but you're definitely talking about a non-rich segment,
right?
But not entirely. And there certainly are real protections here for people who are upper middle class, but just have some pre-existing condition.
Well, and I mean, of course, I mean the big benefit that this gives to a middle class person who probably has health insurance is simply that you won't not have health insurance in the future.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's the I mean, lots of people. Well, and I felt like this was something that could have been talked about more, given the context of the recession. But the reality of a advanced industrial economy is that you can be going along, living your life, have a good job, and then one day you don't have your job anymore. And I mean, eventually you will get another job again. But the way our current system works, I mean, the only reason the current healthcare system works at all in recessions is because we have things like COBRA and the continuous coverage regulations, and I think, I mean, something that the sort of free market healthcare people get off a little too easily on is the extent to which we already in fact have all these government interventions into the marketplace. It's just that they they're quite gappy. So people understandably are nervous about these things. And you hear stories about, people, you mail your COBRA payment in 4 days late and you lose it, and then you can never get sort of coverage again. But, so I mean, it's the main thing you're giving, hopefully, to middle-class people is some kind of peace of mind.
That's right. I think that's the really the biggest share of the coverage part of it. By the way, I do think that the cost control aspect will be significant. I think that's being understated by almost everyone. I think liberal advocates of the bill are being cautious about it because it's uncertain, and we don't want to. And I think there's a little. First of all, that's not what they care about the most,
right?
And they want to be cautious about making claims that may not come true, and we don't know to what extent this will work, and some some aspects of this may work really well, but some may not, and of course on the right you're getting this overweening certainty that none of it will work or have any real effect at all. And I've been analogizing this to the 1993 budget debate, where you had a debate between two sides that were essentially both were wrong. Right. You had liberals saying, well, this is, I guess, some modest, positive, tiny first step, and conservatives saying this is socialism and the end of America, and it turned out to be more than a tiny first step. It turned out to be pretty important.
But so what makes you think that it'll get? I'm happy to reject the sort of conservative arguments that we should trust the CBO except when it scores against us,
right.
And see that there's some cost savings in here, but. Yeah. I don't really see gigantic ones, or any particular reason to think that the extent of it is being underestimated.
Well, you have all the delivery system reforms basically
right.
cost out at zero by CBO.
Right.
So you have to ask yourself, well, obviously, almost certainly they're not going to be zero. And I think a lot of them are pretty important. And part of it's just the fact that there's so much in this bill that it's getting underestimated because you don't have, for instance, if we were just having a fight over the Medicare Medicare Commission, right, or the Independent Medicare Commission, if that was the only thing this bill was doing, and then it passed, people would say, wow, this is a huge deal. You're finally taking this authority out of Congress's hands. Like, this could be potentially revolutionary. But it's just, just one more thing in the bill. There are a lot of things like that each of which individually, if we were fighting about them just as a separate piece, I think people would be talking about a very substantial change. But they're all there. But in a way, because they're all there, they're kind of hiding in plain sight.
Right. Well, I do think that was. I do think part of what was leading some people on the left astray for a long time was precisely that they weren't seeing that there were elements of this bill which, if they were standalone bills, they would be considering enormous victories. But because because this giant Medicaid expansion was part of some other even more giant bill, people were overlooking it as a kind of sideshow. The Medicare Commission seems potentially promising, but this is the area where, I do wonder if, how much is really, really, really going to come of this at the end of the day. I guess what a lot of it depends on, I suppose, is, what do Republicans actually do once they have more seats in Congress and eventually control one or the other house, will control the White House again. At the moment, they have, whipped themselves into a, pretty serious level of opposition to the idea of cutting Medicare. And, it's, on the one hand, it's pretty disingenuous, but on the other hand, it's true that the constituency for their political party is old people. So, I wonder if we'll even transform to a dynamic in which Democrats with particularly in a context where the government is guaranteeing health care to everyone, do Democrats with a younger constituency become much more aggressive at trying to squeeze money out of Medicare in order to free it up for other things, whereas Republicans become very defensive about sort of retirement programs?
That's true. The whole point of the commission is to change the default settings so that it's much harder for Congress to politically intervene to prevent these sort of changes.
Right.
But you're right that it certainly won't be impossible. So with more organizing and effort, they certainly would be able to do it. But it's not as if the commission was designed without that dynamic in mind. Without the dynamic in mind that members of Congress are going to try to protect these programs, and specifically to protect the economic interests that work with the Medicare program, with the device makers and other providers.
Right.
That's exactly the problem that they're trying to get around.
Right, but I mean, so they structured it to sort of come online several years down the road in a way that because I think once it's up and running, whatever of the commission gets up and running will really succeed, because default rules, matter a huge amount, given the way it's not possible to sort of do anything in the United States. But there'll be this sort of, I don't want to just put this on the commission, because I think the bill, the cost savings get unfairly singled out for this critique. But the whole bill comes online, remarkably slowly. I mean, the president sort of signs this thing, and Affordable Care Act is now the law of the land, so you just have to kind of hold on for 3.5 more years, and you'll have guaranteed coverage. And then it's a few more years after that for some of these Medicare ideas, and that strikes me as even when you're in the flush of victory, it's good to have some criticism as just a real blunder on the part of the Democrats.
Agreed. I mean, I've written this. I think you've written this. That the biggest mistake they've made in both the stimulus and in healthcare was putting way too much value on numerology, and just assuming that it's going to be a major difference in public opinion to have your bill be below a certain cost level, and so we have to structure everything around that, as opposed to the actual functions of these pieces of legislation. That like as you've written numerous times, that a larger stimulus, while freaking people out slightly more, would have a much bigger real-world impact on employment, which would make the Democrats more popular. And likewise, creating this window of political vulnerability by delaying the legislation to keep it under an artificial number just radically overstates the public's ability to understand the difference between a $900 billion bill and a $1.6 billion
bill. They haven't tricked anyone. I've seen Republicans on television, nonstop for the past week, talking about how, it's a gimmick, you have 10 years of taxes, 6 years of spending, and it actually, the fact that there's some truth to that criticism actually lets the Republicans get away with more criticism than than is actually warranted, right? But it's
well, it's
people
true
are very
in the sense
suspicious, right? People believe that the government is up to all kinds of crazy accounting gimmicks. So when you want to say, no, this deficit score is not based on accounting gimmicks, it would be really helpful if you genuinely did not have any accounting gimmicks in it. Whereas what they've done is they've given the right something that has a kind of a grain of truth to it. Right. And so then the right can drastically overstate its case, and you or I can't just say, no, he's lying. It's he said there's one thing that's true, and then 6 things that are lying.
The grain of truth is that they gimmicked it to keep the total cost down.
Right.
They didn't gimmick it to keep the deficit sum down. The
10-year number they kept down artificially.
Right, the total cost of the legislation. But in other words, if they moved up the implementation, it wouldn't make the deficit score look worse. It would make it look better if they implemented it sooner. So they didn't. So they gimmicked it just to change the cost line, total cost. But what they're actually arguing over is whether the deficit reduction part of it is phony, and the gimmick of delaying the legislation does not affect the deficit.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Should we move on to number 2? By the
sure.
way, so we have time to.
Too much consensus.
Yeah. Let's try to move into more contentious ground.
Sure. Well, I saw John Cohn up on your site had a kind of a healthcare piece where he was talking about a woman who he's been in touch with and whose sort of sad healthcare story he uses in his book. And he's writing about how that woman hates Barack Obama, hates this healthcare plan, and is convinced in a sort of slightly paranoid way that all the money is going to loafers and moochers. And so he writes a bit, and I think very intelligently about sort of the psychodynamics of all this. But, he doesn't mention race at all in the course of that discussion. And, I don't know this woman. I don't want to say that this woman is like driven in life by passionate racial hatreds or anything of the sort. But, the fact of the matter is that all the evidence indicates that, at least everything I've seen, that race is an important factor in, Americans' dislike for means-tested programs, in Americans' suspicion that government programs, won't kind of help them, and that, this is sort of an important element of American, of politics, particularly around this kind of issue, and something that, needs to be talked about and sort of put on the table if you want to correctly understand what's happening.
Yeah, I think that's true in general, and just so the viewers can understand that the debate we're referring to here between Matt and I is about the propriety of essentially calling people racist. And I think, and I've been saying that it's something you just have to be very, very cautious about doing. You should only do in a circumstance where there's someone where you basically have no other valid explanation. Obviously, I mean, if they say they're racist, you could say they're racist.
Sure.
But beyond the direct confession, you basically need to just rule out any other potential explanation. And I agree with you that obviously racism exists. It's not marginal. It's a very important part of specifically conservative political beliefs, although, there's a lot of conservative political beliefs that aren't related to racism. My problem with your logic, as applying it to an individual person,
sure,
is that you're essentially making a judgment about their motivations that you don't know, and you're making it on the basis of essentially statistics, right? Saying, well, we know lots of conservatives are racist, so you're saying something that a racist would believe, so you're a racist. It's I mean, I wouldn't say it's the equivalent
sure.
of, but it's similar in some ways to, like, disproportionately stopping young black males by the police because, well, we know that they're responsible for a disproportionate number of crimes. But it's not fair to make a judgment about an individual just because, they're statistically more likely because of their identity.
Right, but I mean, in the case of this article, what was coming to my mind was not sort of the sentiment that, well, okay, I think conservatives are more likely to be racists, so therefore I'm going to sort of project that statistical regularity onto someone, but that there was people write in politics a lot, more than, in general, people write more than I would. Of my own druthers about sort of what's motivating people. I mean, you see these articles in the press all the time that they don't just sort of report poll numbers and say, well, that's what we got in the survey. But people try to construct narratives about, connecting with voters and what people are thinking and why. And, you can't, I think, take race off the table when you're having this kind of discussion, when the discussion is, when what you're trying to have is a discussion about what's motivating people, then you need to have, I think, a realistic set of, diagnostic tools as to what the motive possibly is. I mean, the problems with correctly identifying what motivates people, are quite general and have nothing to do with racism per se. Yet it's a subject, we talk about all the time, and and in some ways, I feel like a hesitance to talk about race and to talk about racism leads to a lot of misleading discussions. Like you've heard, a million times over the years about problems Barack Obama is or isn't having connecting with working class voters. And that's the phrase you always hear. But of course, Obama doesn't have a problem connecting with black working class voters, and he doesn't have a problem connecting with Latino working class voters either. So I think it's far too simplistic to say that white working class voters are racists, because obviously part of black people's affection for Barack Obama is a racial motivation on their own part, and it's a two-way street, and there's factors in play that don't relate to race either. But it's a very powerful shaping fact in opinion about American politics. And as long as we're going to have discussions about people's subjective motives, I don't see how you can really sort of leave race and racism out of it.
Well, I agree. That's not what I'm disputing. And I wouldn't say there's any problem with talking about that as a general phenomenon. What I'm talking about is saying identifying a specific person or specific organization or whatever as being racist. I think you need a high burden of proof to do that. That's an explosive charge. Let me give you the example of what made me write my first item about
sure.
this. This was something that Gawker did. So some conservatives were emailing around a photo of Obama with his feet up on the desk, talking to some of his advisors who are white. Mm-hmm. And then these conservatives were outraged at this photo, how disrespectful. And then Gawker was basically saying, well, look, there's a photo of Bush doing the same thing, and they weren't outraged, and therefore, these right-wingers are racist. Well, probably some of them are, but you don't know that the person who did that is racist. I mean, can you come up with another reason why they would apply some total double standard to the behavior of a Republican and a Democratic president besides race? I mean, of course you can.
Sure.
They did it to Clinton,
sure.
Constantly. So I would say, they're being hypocritical and partisan, and
right.
It's possible that race is part of their motivation, but just to say that it must be race, that put me off.
No, I mean, I agreed with you on that case. And I do think more generally, actually, that we've had a new president since January 2009. He's African American, and there've been a lot of people freaking out sort of ever since.
Yes.
And there's been a tendency on a lot of liberals to attribute that to the fact that Barack Obama is black, when I think the evidence from the Clinton years is that the mere existence of a Democratic president of any kind could cause exactly these kind of freakouts. And actually, if you look at the way, the curious way that the Carter administration continues to be discussed and was discussed at the Times in the precincts of the right, you see that there's a kind of paranoid conservatism in American life that it has some relationship to racial issues, but that is displaying itself, I think, overwhelmingly for reasons that have to do with a dislike of the Democratic Party and of liberals.
Right. Right, and there's a parallel to that belief structure on the left, but I think it's a very marginal, as opposed to it's a influential, even dominant belief system on the right, but it's a very marginal one on the left. Just to make clear that I don't believe this is totally a phenomenon of the right. I think there's a parallel. Anyway,
right? No, I mean, there's a paranoid politics is not a unique ideological precinct, but it's certainly I think you see in the Obama years it really coming to the center of what the conservative movement is doing in a way that was never the case when Bush was president. I mean, you would get. Even when I would get people sort of like emailing around these like lists of like 14 attributes of fascist regimes and showing that Bush already has us on 12 of them, I don't think I ever heard a member of Congress talking about that.
Exactly. Right. That's exactly right. This was pretty segregated from mainstream politics and even the mainstream political debate. You would find it in left wing websites and some talk radio sometimes, but it was pretty isolated. But anyway, so let's get back to the race conversation. I think we're in agreement. It sounded like we're in agreement. So let me push again on an area where I think we might have been disagreeing before.
Right.
Where Trent Franks had these comments about abortion and slavery,
right.
Where he said that basically like abortion is worse than slavery.
Right.
And I think you portrayed that as minimizing the evils of slavery, and I said, well, no, he's just making the maximalist case about the evils of abortion, which, if you believe that case, it is worse than slavery. Because however bad slavery is, it's better to be enslaved. I mean, I don't want to step in my own racial imbroglio, but it's better to be enslaved than to be murdered.
Well, plenty of people
were
killed in the
well, certainly that's true. But proceeding, if you start from the premise that I disagree with that abortion is exactly like murdering any person, then to say that abortion is worse than anything else is not a leap. I mean, you've already made the leap. So once you're in the business of comparing it, sure, compare an insidious comparison to slavery, to the Holocaust, to anything else is really not an important logical leap at that point. So I was saying that he's really not saying that slavery wasn't so bad or that blacks would be better off under slavery than not being slaves. He was making a comparison to abortion.
Well, but I mean, he was saying that legalized abortion, right, that post Roe v. Wade policy status quo in the United States was more devastating to the African American community than slavery, which I mean, I do think was a way of, I think you adequately explained there, what it was he thought he was saying. What the calculation in his head was as to why that panned out. And the point wasn't that, slavery's fine. The point is that slavery was terrible and abortion is even worse, right? But this falls into a pattern that, I don't think it's I think it's clear that he didn't say that out of animosity toward black people. But what you often see from conservatives, even, very thoughtful, respectable conservatives, is a kind of cluelessness about race in the United States of America. And a refusal to take seriously sort of what slavery was. That you saw in a couple weeks ago, there was this National Review cover story about Barack Obama and American exceptionalism. There was supposed to be this intellectual, magnum opus from Rich Lowry, and and they're talking about how America is different from Europe because we didn't have an entrenched set of serfs. And then they're aware enough that they were well, okay, there was slavery. And then in the next sentence they say, but it didn't imprint itself on the American psyche. At which point you're thinking, well, okay, I mean, obviously it didn't imprint itself on Rich Lowry's psyche, but that's sort of, that just is the problem with the right and race, right?
Right, well, especially when, after slavery, I mean, people, so many former slaves were basically existing in slave-like conditions for decades on end.
And I mean, the marginality of that experience to the sort of median American is precisely the point, right? I mean, that's the way in which it was impressed on American life, that it's not just that a specific group of people were treated poorly for a period of time and then it ended, but that a whole large group of people were in a completely different social structure, continuing for decades after the end of the Civil War. And you can see, a continuation of that. There was this Newt Gingrich did an interview, I think, with Dan Balls, where he was warning Democrats off passing health care. And Gingrich said, well, it'll be like how Lyndon Johnson shattered the Democratic coalition in the 60s. And the Post paraphrased that as, he had a direct quote, and then it was with measures such as civil rights legislation. And so then there was kind of an uproar about that well, okay, if there was anything that was ever worth, taking political risks over, it would be something like that. And for Gingrich to be sitting there saying that, passing the Civil Rights Act was some huge blunder by the Johnson administration was kind of telling. And so then Gingrich went, and he's done this sort of backtracking thing. And he said, no. When he said that, he didn't have civil rights in mind. He meant other divisive social
Medicare, right?
Yeah, well, whatever. And I don't believe him for a moment. I mean, the fact of the matter is that in the conservative telling of American history, right, I mean, this guy, Kennedy, and then Johnson came in, and a bunch of nutty liberals, and they did all this crazy stuff, and it was a tragic time for the country. Bill Kristol, wrote that The Great Society was a tragic episode in American life. And then when you throw back at them, well, no, this was the time when African Americans were given the right to vote, were given the right to participate in civil society, and the backlash was largely about that. They immediately retreat and they say, oh, no, that's not what I was talking about.
Right, that was good.
But, the denial of the extent to which that episode was at the center of the politics of the 60s is a kind of neglect of the interests and existence of African Americans that, I think makes some talk of racism not unjustified.
I agree, but again, you want to talk. I agree with you about talking about racism as a general problem in American life and as an attribute of conservative politics in general. But what I'm saying is when you're talking about an individual, it can get very, very explosive. You want to be very certain what you're talking about. Now, Rush Limbaugh is someone I think you can at least be very certain that he's playing upon the racial fears of whites.
Right.
I mean, that's, I think, beyond denial. The problem I have when you're talking about an individual and you're calling a person a racist or implying that a person's racist, and the same is true, basically I think you get the same dynamic with anti-Semitism. I think you have several problems. Number one, you're talking about motives, and it's very hard to prove that. Number two, you have different definitions of what exactly this charge means. So if you wanted to say that the obvious ways that Rush Limbaugh is playing upon the racial fears of whites means he's a racist, Rush Limbaugh will interpret that to mean, I hate black people, and then say, well, no, he doesn't hate black people. He's got this friend who's black and this other friend who's black. And then you just get into this definitional trap. And number three, you shift the debate over whatever the substance it is they're saying into kind of into victimology land, where whoever is being targeted with the accusation will rally all their friends and ideological allies to say, see how powerful and evil our enemies are, and they try to shut down any discussion of what it is I'm trying to discuss by calling me a racist or an anti-Semite, and you get this tribalistic warfare, which basically just makes debate impossible. And again, I think this happens with both things. I think, I think it's very, very parallel in a lot of ways. So that's why I do think it makes a lot of sense to just, if you think that someone is wrong, you don't need to say that they're racist in addition. You can just show how they're wrong. And if you can't show how that person is wrong, then you have no business calling them racist or anti-Semitic. So in either case, you're not really adding something. Unless you're dealing with a situation where it's so obvious that there's just no other way. You're talking about someone who's extreme,
sure,
right? Like I've written about George Allen. George Allen,
sure,
with his Confederate flag pins in multiple people over the course of many years saying he's used the word nigger to describe black people. Right? That's like the definition of being racist. But in anything where it's a little murkier, I just think it benefits everyone to stay away from that.
Well, so I mean, I agree with some of what you say about the sort of unproductive nature, particularly if you're trying to have a back and forth, debate with people of those kind of hot accusations. But what I worry about is, I mean, I feel like almost part of the sort of anti-racist backlash in the United States has been the construction of this idea that it's like such an explosive charge to hint around in someone's direction that you have to, always kind of, hold your powder and bend over backwards. And I sort of have a running joke about this I don't know if it's a joke, but it's like, anytime you bring up the fact that, Barry Goldwater and, William F. Buckley Jr., and as best I can tell, all of the founders of the modern American conservative movement were advocates of endless white supremacy in the southern United States. Unless you put in a little parentheses where you're like, and of course I'm sure that all of them had honorable, principled reasons about economic regulation, none of them in any way motivated by race, what you get is 1,000 hysterical conservatives in the comments section going on about how, there goes Yglesias again, calling us all racists, when simply to point out that the Goldwater campaign platform and the Young Americans for Freedom and the Sharon statement, which, the Tea Party crowd recently tried to remove, were in fact statements of political support for a white supremacist system, is, as best I can tell, it's an effort to actually describe what's happening without saying anything about people's motives. But when it's sort of accepted that there cannot be, that it's like the worst thing you could do is imply that someone is a racist, it makes it difficult to I just think speak honestly about, what it is people think is going on.
I don't think it's that difficult. I mean, you can just say that we don't know. Let's take the example you're discussing. We don't know anything about the motivations of Barry Goldwater or William F. Buckley. What we can say is that their ideology would have this horrific result, which is a good reason to question their ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see why you really need to say. I mean, you could say more than that, but I don't see what getting into the question of their motivations, which is again totally unknowable. Mm-hmm. What that gets you. You could say that it would have this consequence, but without necessarily speculating about their motives.
Right, but I mean, it matters when you're talking. I mean, I think there's certain contexts in which what you're saying is totally right, and that we can just be having a sort of dry discussion of, strict harm principle or certain readings of the 10th Amendment and point out to someone, look, what you're saying has this consequence. I think you would reject that consequence, or I think my audience would agree that consequence is repugnant. Therefore it's false. But I mean, a lot of life, and a lot of what matters in politics and in talking about politics is the construction of narratives, about what's going on. And I think the fact that, the sort of rebellion against the moderate Republicans, the construction of the modern form of the conservative movement, was in large part about counter-mobilizing against the civil rights movement, is relevant to accurately understanding it. And I mean, I do think, it's all for the best to avoid going further than you really, really need to into thinking about, what motivated dead people. But obviously, there's a certain kind of total indifference to the fate of people who are of another ethnic group. That's in play there, and I just think it does. It weakens the argument about sort of the battle for history and what's going on to
I agree,
insist on such a bloodless approach.
I do want to make clear that I'm not disputing the value of discussing this when talking about large groups of people in large forces. Right. What I'm specifically talking about is ascribing the motives of an individual.
Okay.
That's the line where I think that's the line where I think that's important.
So should we switch to Israel, where we will accuse no one of anti-Semitism or of attempting to silence people with charges of anti-Semitism?
You're putting me in a difficult spot because I was just thinking that this conversation was running long and I wanted to stop it. But now if I say that, someone's going to show this video and look like I'm just trying to dodge it completely. But we have been talking for a long time, and I really do want to discuss this with you. But I also, I don't know. You could probably get off this. You probably have like 4 items set to go online during the course of taping this. But I'm not as productive as you. All right,
that's fair enough. I don't actually have anything earth-shattering to say on this subject.
I will do it. I'm not dodging this. I swear, anyone out there, I'm willing to discuss this in a public forum with Matthew Yglesias. Just we'll have to do it at a different time.
All right. It's probably, it's because you're a racist.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Anti-Semite. We'll talk about it next time.
Fair enough. All right.
All right.
Good to talk to you.
Oh, you too. Bye.
Bye.